Hello there, welcome back to Planet America's Situation Room. I'm John Barron.
I'm Asst, and once again, we've got a situation.
More American troops are in the Middle East as the war expands, and more reports of U.S. casualties.
Millions of people came together at more than 3,000 different No Kings demonstrations.
As President Trump keeps the option of a ground war alive, he claims that peace talks are underway.
Meanwhile, is Trump manipulating the stock markets? And is someone close to him cashing in? But first...
All in all, it was a head-spinning week as the US and Israeli war on Iran entered its second month. The American president was announcing and postponing deadlines for Iran to open the Strait of Hormuz at a dizzying rate. First came this.
If Iran doesn't fully open without threat the Strait of Hormuz within 48 hours from this exact point in time, the United States will hit and obliterate their various power plants.
Not so exact as it turns out, as that was about to expire.
I've instructed the Department of War to postpone any and all military strikes against Iranian power plants and energy infrastructure for a 5-day period.
5 days? And then?
I am pausing the period of energy plant destruction by 10 days.
So hang on, that's now when?
Monday, April 6, 2026 at 8 p.m. Eastern Time.
Oh. And the pause was because President Trump claimed that talks with Iran were underway, a claim that Iran's top diplomat, Foreign Minister Araghchi, flatly denied.
I don't think the question of talking with Americans or negotiation with Americans once again would be on the table.
And as Araghchi points out, the Iranians were in negotiations with the Americans last June, when the US and Israel launched their airstrikes against Iran's nuclear facilities, and were again in the middle of talks at the start of this conflict in late February. A case of fool me twice, perhaps. But Trump maintained the negotiations are underway.
We're dealing with some people that I find to be very reasonable, very solid. The people within know who they are. They're very respected.
President Trump claimed, in fact, the Iranians are so keen to cut a deal, they're giving him presents.
It was a very big present worth a tremendous amount of money. So that meant one thing to me: we'd deal with the right people.
Intriguing. Politico reported, though, that several people close to the White House said they were baffled by the president's remarks. And for a day or so, Trump was very coy about what this gift might be. But then he just couldn't keep it in any longer after envoy Steve Witkoff said it was okay to blab.
You know, I told you about a present, right? Steve, can I reveal the present?
You can do anything you want.
Thank you. They said to show you the fact that we're real and solid and we're there. We're going to let you have 8 boats of oil. 8 boats. 8 big boats of oil.
8 big boats, which soon became 10 big boats. And while the White House would give no details about who owned those big boats and where the oil in them was headed, the 10 ships are still just a drop in the ocean. Before this war began, about 138 ships passed through the Strait of Hormuz each and every day. For the past month, that has slowed to a relative trickle of around 5 to 6 vessels a day. According to Reuters, the US then produced a 15-point peace plan conveyed to Iran via Pakistani intermediaries, calling for the removal of Iran's stocks of highly enriched uranium, halting enrichment, curbing their ballistic missile program, and cutting off funding for regional allies. Less than 24 hours later, Tehran publicly rejected that plan. But then, in what was sounding more and more like a negotiation of sorts, came an Iranian counter-offer, which included the US and Israel paying reparations, recognising Iran's sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz, ending international sanctions on Tehran, and implementing a wider Middle East ceasefire that would protect Iran's proxy groups.
Well, John, that's one pathway for negotiations, but we shouldn't forget the alternative negotiations pathway that Pete Hegseth has been exploring.
And that's why we see ourselves as part of this negotiation as well. We negotiate with bombs.
Thanks, Pete. Very helpful. But there were some elements of Trump's negotiations announcement that seemed a tad fishy. Firstly, the timing was impossible to ignore. Trump's announcement of a 5-day extension came a full 12 hours before his deadline expired. but only 2 hours before the market opened on a Monday morning. Even the Iranians noticed that one, saying that every week when markets open, Trump makes these kinds of statements to drive down oil prices. Even his 5-day deadline aligns with the closure of the energy market, which was true. And this wasn't a one-off either. The entire Iran war started on a Saturday. The Venezuelan operation occurred on a Saturday. Trump seems to like doing crazy stuff when the markets are closed on Saturdays in the hope that he can get most of it wrapped up by the time the markets reopen on Monday. And then he'll be on his best behaviour again. And if Trump isn't trying to manipulate the market, well, someone else in his administration does seem to be. On the same morning that Trump announced his 5-day extension, around 6,200 Brent and West Texas Intermediate futures oil contracts changed hands between 6:49 and 6:50 a.m., just 15 minutes before Trump's announcement. Those trades were worth about $580 million. Also, the S&P 500 stock market futures experienced a lot of trade during that same minute. One trader said, "My gut from watching markets for the last 25 years is this is really abnormal. It's Monday morning, there's no important data today, there aren't any Fed speakers you want to front run, it's an unusually large trade for a day with no event risk. Somebody just got a lot richer." But maybe it's just a coincidence. We can't know for sure, can we? Maybe there were 6,200 contracts traded that particular minute for no particular reason, even though during the same period of time over the previous 5 days, the average trading level had been around 700 contracts. Let's look at that on a graph, shall we? This shows you the suspicious spike on the left of oil contract trading, and on the right, that's the suspicious spike of S&P futures. Those spikes do look a little sus, don't they? And it didn't end there. Over on the poly market prediction market, one trader has made nearly $1 million since 2024 from dozens of well-timed poly market bets that have correctly predicted US and Israeli military actions against Iran. In fact, this person has won 93% of their 5-figure wagers about Iran, all of them about unannounced military operations. Isn't that interesting? They jumped in hours before the Israeli strikes in October 2024, hours before the US airstrikes on Iran's nuclear facilities in June 2025, and hours before the war began just now. What a lucky ducky. And if you're expecting an insider trading investigation to whoever is behind all these trades, don't hold your breath, because the US Securities and Exchange Commission's top enforcement official left abruptly last week after only 6 months on the job. You see, she was clashing with agency leaders over the direction of its enforcement program. She apparently wanted to be more aggressive in pursuing charges for fraud and other misconduct, even in cases that touched the president's circle. Her bosses, though, disagreed. Also, the Justice Department's Public Integrity Section, who could also investigate this kind of thing, were reduced last year from having 36 lawyers to having just 2. And they were stripped of their authority to file new cases. So, John, for now at least, war profiteering seems to be open for business.
Yeah, it's an age-old profession. President Trump's cabinet met this week and they were unanimous in their praise for the way this war is being conducted. None more so than the back of Vice President J.D. Vance's head.
Now, there's been a lot of reporting about diplomatic options, about negotiations. There's, of course, Pete and his team. There are further military options. But what we have now that we didn't have when the president took over just a little over a year ago is the ability to use every tool at our disposal to ensure that Iran doesn't get a nuclear weapon.
But those tools are being used at a massive cost, a human toll of more than 4,500 people dead. And while the full economic toll is much harder to quantify, the United States is estimated to be spending up to $1 billion per day on its war efforts against Iran. Meanwhile, back at the White House, the president was keen to talk about what great value his favourite felt-tip pen represents.
So this pen is very inexpensive, but it writes well. I like it. But I can't have the pen the way it was. You know what it is. I don't want to give too much publicity, but they do treat me well, Sharpie.
And that led to headlines like this.
Trump rambles about Sharpie pens for 5 straight minutes during high-level cabinet meeting amid Iran war.
To be fair, it was a bit odd. But while all of that was going on, the military build-up to a possible ground war continues, with 1,500 paratroopers from the US 82nd Airborne Division being deployed and 2 Marine units likely headed for the region as well. And the Wall Street Journal has reported the Pentagon is weighing sending another 10,000 US ground troops to the Middle East. Meanwhile, Secretary of State Marco Rubio maintains that, well, that's all just a contingency plan.
But we can achieve all of our objectives without ground troops, but we are always going to be prepared to give the president maximum optionality and maximum opportunity to adjust to contingencies should they emerge.
Secretary Rubio went on to tell reporters he expects this war to last weeks, not months, and he also gave this update on the status of negotiations, which sounded kind of vague.
We've got messages. We've had an exchange of messages and indications from the Iranian system, whatever's left of it, about a willingness to talk about certain things. We're waiting for further clarification about who is it that we would be talking to, what will we be talking about, and when will we be talking.
That's the problem, of course, when you knock off most of the senior leadership of a country. Who do you talk to? But while they wait to find all of that out, the contingency planning continues.
Yeah, look, they keep saying how the war's almost over, John. I'm sure they want it to be almost over, but when the House Armed Services Committee had a secret Pentagon briefing this week, the committee left less than impressed. One congressional rep said there was no plan, no strategy, no endgame shared, and they didn't give any answers. It's unclear if there isn't a plan or if there is a plan and they wouldn't share it with the members. All that no plan talk is very negative. I prefer Fox News' way of putting it, that Trump has a doctrine of unpredictability. Yes, that sounds better, doesn't it? Either way, this war is not going to be ending until the Strait of Hormuz is reopened. Even with all the countermeasures being employed, global oil production during this war has been down 11 million barrels per day. That's more than the loss from the oil shocks in 1973 and 1979 combined. The World Food Programme estimates that if the Strait isn't reopened soon, 45 million more people could face acute food insecurity this year. And believe it or not, this could get way worse. A recession is considered to be the best case scenario if the Strait remains closed throughout the year. Some economic forecasters are predicting depressions, especially given importers haven't felt the full brunt of the oil restrictions yet. Remember, tankers take 3 to 4 weeks to get where they're going, so many tankers that left before the war began are yet to arrive at their final destinations. And after all those tankers are done, that is when we'll get the real crunch. That's coming over the next fortnight. But how do you reopen the Strait? It just takes one Iranian with one drone or missile to scare insurance companies into making travel through the Strait untenable. And as Trump's old defense secretary Jim Mattis noted, Iranians have anti-ship cruise missiles that could be fired off the back of a pickup truck and can go 100 miles. That's a problem. Even if Trump did get the Strait under control, it's not clear he has any idea what he's going to do with it.
And who's in control of it? Will Iran still be able to control the flow of oil?
Be jointly controlled.
By who?
Maybe me. Maybe me.
You want the United States to be in
Me
control
and the Ayatollah, whoever the Ayatollah is.
He's got that all worked out, doesn't he? And Iran has every incentive to keep the Strait blocked up. They've reportedly begun charging ships $2 million to pass safely through Hormuz. So why would they give that up? Also concerning to America would be that with the help of Russian satellite navigation, Iran has made a mess of America's military bases. Many of the 13 military bases in the region used by American troops are now all but uninhabitable, according to the New York Times. The Kuwaiti base has been most damaged, but they have also hit the radar system in Qatar, the communications equipment in Bahrain, and the communications equipment in Saudi Arabia. It's almost like those Russians know what they're doing. So these are all concerns for Trump as he tries to find a way out of the Middle East, even as his allies, like say the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, have been apparently pushing for him to stay in the Middle East. The Crown Prince believes that Iran poses a long-term threat to the Gulf that can only be eliminated by getting rid of the government. But how you do that is anyone's guess. Just before we go to the interview though, John, I do want to note a second conflict that's gained far less attention, at least in the Western media. It's in Lebanon. Paramilitary group Hezbollah launched attacks on Israel the day after Israel attacked Iran, and the Lebanese government were not impressed. They announced that all of Hezbollah's military activities were illegal and banned, and they instructed the military to confiscate Hezbollah's weapons. But that was not enough for Israel, who are a little bit tired of Hezbollah doing whatever they please, regardless of what the Lebanese government has to say. And so Israel announced it would occupy southern Lebanon to create a defensive buffer. We're talking about 10th of Lebanon here. Israel told the civilians to evacuate, and they've now destroyed 5 bridges and demolished a whole bunch of homes in Lebanese villages. Israel say they're doing this to fight Hezbollah, but under international law, those attacks are pretty questionable. And now you have over 1,000 people dead and 1 million civilians displaced, and Israel say they intend to continue this conflict in Lebanon even after the campaign against Iran ends. So how this second conflict ends is also unclear. Lebanon's been getting thoroughly sick of Hezbollah recently, and Israel could potentially have worked hand in hand with Lebanon against Hezbollah, but whether that's going to be possible now after this attack, I don't know.
Well, for more, we're joined by Ambassador Daniel Shapiro, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defence for the Middle East under President Biden, where he negotiated to try and restart the 2015 Iran nuclear deal torn up by President Trump in his first term. And he's also US Ambassador to Israel under President Obama. Ambassador Shapiro, welcome to Planet America. Can I ask you, Ambassador, for your reaction to these reports we're seeing today that the US is considering a ground operation not just to try and force to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, but also a special operation to potentially seize enriched uranium from Iran?
There are now about 3 or maybe 4 different ground operations that have been mentioned in various reports, that the 2 Marine Expeditionary Units and the members of the 82nd Airborne Division of the Army and perhaps some additional ground forces that might come to the region might be taking part in. One is to seize Karg Island, that's the oil export terminal. Another is to seize islands or shoreline along the Strait of Hormuz to try to open the strait for free shipping. And a third is to seize the highly enriched uranium that Iran still has, about 10 nuclear weapons worth, if it were to enrich it further to weapons grade. Any of those operations, if the president orders them, are going to add several more weeks minimum to this conflict. So I think that's probably a decision he hasn't made yet. But once you put those forces in place, once you identify these 2 very important goals, one is to extract the highly enriched uranium and the other is to open the Strait of Hormuz, and you have forces there who might be able to carry those out, it's tempting to use them, just as he was tempted to use the big force he brought in February when he was in negotiations with Iran. So I think it's highly likely we're going to see some ground operations. I don't know which one of those, but any of those mean several more weeks of fighting, probably more Iranian attacks on Gulf oil and gas installations, and potentially a metastasizing economic crisis around the world.
Are you surprised at the president's surprise at the retaliation by Iran against America's regional allies and the fact that this war has continued to escalate in a way that he says he didn't think it would?
I am surprised that the president seems not to have expected some of this escalation because, and I served in the Pentagon during the Biden administration and did a lot of work on the war plans for Iran in case they were needed. And nobody in the Pentagon, nobody in U.S. Central Command, CENTCOM, is surprised because these have long been expected to be the Iranian plays. I think he did have in mind that following the relative success of the 12-day war last June, which involved just one night of U.S. strikes on the B-2 bombers on the underground nuclear enrichment facilities, and the success in extracting Maduro from Venezuela, again with one night of special operations, I think he may have convinced himself that Iran could also be a very quick, one-and-done kind of military operation, that the regime, which was under pressure from the population after the protests in January, might just crumble, and that this might be a very easy task to complete. But I don't think that was ever realistic. Now we're faced with that reality, and I think he's in his improvisational mode, and you hear it in what he says, very different things in different conversations with different reporters or different public statements. Sometimes he does emphasize regime change. Sometimes he says we're almost done, the war is basically won. Sometimes he says we're on the verge of inserting ground forces, which is obviously going to extend the war. So I'm not sure he knows exactly what he wants to achieve, and that's the concern I have, is that the lack of the clarity of strategic objective means a very difficult reaching of an endpoint to the war.
Ambassador, the New York Times ran a piece this week about the extensive damage that Iran has done to US military bases in the region. This was a surprise, given we keep hearing about how Iran's getting smashed without much response to America. So have we been victims of US war propaganda here, or did the New York Times get this one wrong?
Iran has taken a lot of punishment during this war, but even though it's the weaker party, Iran has cards to play. And among those are these very effective targeting of U.S. and Gulf facilities with their drones and missiles, or sometimes a combination of the two, which have been able to penetrate, maybe overwhelm the air defenses of that country. And so we have seen reports, I think credible reports, of damage done on U.S. military bases, damage done, we know of, on Gulf oil and gas facilities and other civilian infrastructure. Obviously, some strikes have also penetrated the Israeli air defenses. So Iran is the weaker party, but between those capabilities and their success until now in keeping the Strait of Hormuz shut and imposing a great deal of economic pressure, not just on the countries of the region, but really on the entire globe, they are playing their cards fairly well for the weaker party, and we haven't fully been able to find answers for them.
And Ambassador, what about Israel's invasion of Lebanon? Would they have been better off trying to work with the Lebanese government to isolate Hezbollah, in your view, or is directly attacking Hezbollah the only way you can realistically stop them?
We reached a ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah at the end of 2024, and the part of the provisions of that ceasefire was that the Lebanese government and the Lebanese armed forces, which in my judgment genuinely are oppositional to Hezbollah, were to take the responsibility with help from the United States, help from Israel with intelligence and so forth, to actually disarm Hezbollah, to really make it so that there was not a militia in the hands of this terrorist organization that held arms and could act outside the control of the state. And unfortunately, over the year plus since that time, the Lebanese government and armed forces have not really fulfilled that requirement. Now, when the war began in Iran, Hezbollah immediately started firing again into Israel, making very clear that they are more loyal to Iran and the regime there than they are to Lebanon. And by pulling Lebanon back into a war that most Lebanese, including many Shia Lebanese, who are ostensibly the Hezbollah constituents, don't want to be pulled back into. There was no question that Israel had to respond once attacked, but it's probably still the case that an Israeli operation alone is not going to fully solve that problem. There has to be some combination of deterrence and, when necessary, strikes, combined with diplomacy and combined with strengthening the capability and the legitimacy of the Lebanese government and armed services to actually do what they must do, which is to finish the job of disarming Hezbollah once and for all.
Thrown under the bus with Pete Hegseth.
We can take a stop and make a little journey into the Middle East and eliminate a big problem. Pete, I think you were the first one to speak up, and you said, let's do it.
The war was all Pete's idea.
We killed their Navy in, would you say 3 days, Pete? Gone. In fact, I was a little upset with Pete. I said, why didn't you save the ships? We could have used them, right? He said, it's more fun shooting them down.
I tried to stop Pete bombing ships, but he was having too much fun.
The only two people that were quite disappointed, I said, Pete and General Raisin Kane, this thing's going to be settled very soon. Here they go. Oh, that's too bad. Pete didn't want it to be settled.
Pete doesn't want a ceasefire.
I'll tell you, somebody came up to me yesterday and gave you a very hard time. When I tell you who, you're not even going to believe it. He gave you such a nasty hard time, but you're doing great.
Someone important said Pete sucks. but I think he's great. And that's being thrown under the bus with Pete Hegseth.
Largely obscured by this war with Iran has been the political battle in Congress over funding for the Department of Homeland Security.
This morning, Democrats are refusing to fund the Department of Homeland Security until Republicans agree on reforms to immigration enforcement tactics. That means 90% of Homeland Security workers, including personnel at the TSA, Secret Service, Coast Guard, and FEMA, are working without a paycheck.
That was mid-February. Ironically, given this partial shutdown was over Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE agency tactics, they were still being paid. While those other workers, including Transport Security Agency staff who screen passengers at airports, have been forced to work without pay ever since. Hundreds of TSA staff have quit as a result. Others have been phoning in sick to do paid work elsewhere, and the queues at airports have grown and grown.
Long security lines were seen across major hubs like Houston, New Orleans, and Atlanta, with wait times stretching up to 3 hours.
Yeah, this isn't good for anyone, John. You know, when you add up both this shutdown and the last shutdown together, TSA workers haven't been paid in a standard manner for about 57% of the fiscal year so far. And that's been going for 6 months. Or, as the new DHS Secretary Mark Wayne Mullen puts it,
they're working for free because of political politics.
Hear, hear. Political politics strikes again. The problem is some of these workers can literally not afford to feed their families without being paid, so they've turned to food banks or applied for public assistance. Others, as you said, John, have had to skip work to take on gig work instead, like delivering packages or driving for rideshare apps. So let's do the numbers. There are 50,000 TSA workers who aren't being paid. 11.8% of them didn't turn up to work on Thursday. Do the math, that's about 6,000 workers missing. So when Trump last week sent 100 to 150 untrained ICE agents to fill in for the 6,000 missing workers, that was never going to solve the problem. Hence the growing queues.
Well, when it came to trying to solve this problem, last week President Trump did intervene, announcing that he would sign an order instructing the Secretary of Homeland Security, Mark Wayne Mullen, to immediately pay those TSA agents. And with both sides fearing that there would soon be a political price to pay for travel chaos over the spring break and the Easter vacation, suddenly it did seem like political politics would see a way through this.
The Senate voted unanimously to fund most of DHS in a rare overnight session. It comes just hours before lawmakers are set to leave town for the Easter holiday.
This Senate bill essentially did what Democrats had been demanding for the last 6 weeks: fund the DHS through to the end of the next fiscal year, except for ICE and border control operations. The Republicans had a workaround, which was to fund those agencies through the party line budget reconciliation process, which just needs 51 votes, not a 60-vote avoidance of the filibuster. So it was unanimous, and senators headed to the airport themselves, assuming the deal would pass the House, be signed into law by the president, but not so fast.
The reason that we can't accept this ridiculousness, okay, is because we're not going to risk not funding the agencies that keep the American people safe.
In fact, Johnson's Republican caucus could not swallow the ICE and border control carve-outs. They rejected the Senate bill. They passed a short-term funding bill of their own, which would have gone back to the Senate if there had been anybody there to vote on it, but it has still probably not gotten the votes to get through.
Which means the TSA workers are going to be relying on Trump's executive order to pay them out of some other fund for at least the 2-week Easter break. Now, we should say it's unclear what legal authority the White House has to do that. It certainly seems like a clear violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act, which outlaws spending money that has not been appropriated by Congress. But then again, who's going to sue Trump for paying TSA workers? Are the Democrats going to do that? Not sure about that, so he's probably going to get away with it. As for the standoff between the House and Senate Republicans, let's make crystal clear that what they're fighting over is pure symbolism. ICE has received tens of billions of dollars of funding from the big beautiful bill already. It doesn't need this money. The House is fighting for ICE's funding simply to not let the Democrats win a symbolic battle. It's petty stuff. On the Senate side, though, there is a good reason for Senate Republicans to try to vote for ICE funding through budget reconciliation. What they're hoping to do is not only pass ICE funding, but also add to the same bill the Save America Act election reform bill, and maybe also the $200 billion of funding for the Iran war as well, all supposedly requiring only 50 Senate votes. Well, that's their hope at least. Many people, including Save America Act enthusiast Senator Mike Lee, say it's just not going to work.
The restrictions themselves have basically zero chance of meeting the standard to pass through budget reconciliations.
What we should note is that by agreeing to this path, Senate Democrats have given something up, something substantial. They were negotiating for ICE to improve their ways in return for that funding money. And Senate Republicans had already agreed to expand the use of body cameras, to limit ICE enforcement at hospitals and schools, to enforce visible officer identification, to guarantee congressional oversight of ICE detention centres, and to not deport or knowingly detain any US citizen for immigration reasons. That all sounds kind of like common sense to me, John, but it's now all gone, kaput. And that seems a bit of a shame.
A bit of a shame, but not really a surprise. Meanwhile, Mike Johnson may not have to worry about this fiddly business of passing bills for much longer, with polls this week suggesting that the Republicans are hurtling towards an electoral abyss. This November, a Quinnipiac poll had Democrats opening an extraordinary 11 percentage point lead in the generic congressional ballot. The average of polls this week is at 5.5 percentage points. Either way, though, Democrats are feeling very confident. They'll soon have Johnson's speaker's gavel, opening up a whole new set of problems for the president. And if the thousands of No Kings protests in every state this weekend were any indication, there's a lot of simmering anger in America right now, a lot of it being directed at Donald Trump. And that's all for another trip to Planet America. We'll be back at the usual time of 9:35 p.m. next Monday night here on ABC TV.
And you also find us on ABC iView, YouTube and Facebook. And don't forget this week's Planet Extra Pep podcast, where we're discussing a whole lot more shutdown. See you there.
Bye-bye.